We'll get started.
Hi, Dina's mom.
All right, so we'll get started as people trickle in the group. So I want to say good morning to everyone in the United States, or I think most of us are in the morning. But I also want to say good afternoon, good evening. There are many people attending from Asia, from Sub-Saharan Africa, from the Middle East, my own region, also Europe as well, and Latin America. To everybody, welcome. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dina Sherif. I'm the Executive Director of the Legatum Center for Development and Entrepreneurship, which is based at the MIT Sloan School of Management. For those of you who really don't know why the center was established, it was established over 12 years ago to promote entrepreneurship as a strategic pathway to prosperity, specifically within emerging markets. Before we begin the discussion, I have a few housekeeping issues to bring up that I promised my team I would address. Please write your questions in the Q&A box. We will get to them midway in the session. As always, if you'd like to get involved in the center, please reach out to the Legatum Center. We will also be hosting another discussion webinar on the role of trade in supporting entrepreneurship on October 14th. We'd love it if you'd sign up for that as well. There we go. The link is in the chat group. So why we're here today, we have an amazing group of speakers. We have Brad Feld, we have Christopher Schroeder, we have Fiona Murray. And I personally, I've dedicated the past 15 years of my career to supporting entrepreneurship, specifically across the Middle East. I myself, I'm an entrepreneur, also an investor, or I'm sure as Chris is thinking, a newbie to the venture capital world. I recently joined as a partner in a new fintech fund out of Egypt called DisruptTech. And I think for me, and for many of us who are in the entrepreneurship space within emerging markets, our biggest concern with COVID is what will happen to the momentum of entrepreneurship in our countries. Over the past decade, we've seen a huge surge in entrepreneurship and innovation coming out of emerging markets. Unfortunately, we have yet to see the same surge in venture capital and capital flowing to these markets, but we're definitely seeing a rise in innovation and entrepreneurship, which we know is critical to the growth of our countries. So this discussion that we're having here today is to really think about, with these amazing speakers, how as emerging markets we can continue to develop our entrepreneurship and innovation ecosystems and continue to see these communities thrive. So very quickly, I wanted to introduce our speakers. We have Brad Feld, who recently wrote this book, The Startup Community Way, which I highly encourage that you all buy. I thoroughly enjoyed reading the group, which Christopher Schroeder recommended that I buy a couple months back. Brad is also an investor, co-founder of Techstars, co-founder of the Foundry Group, and an author of many blogs, articles, and books as well. We also have Christopher Schroeder, who's an entrepreneur, an investor, author of Startup Rising, and a dear, dear friend. I just wanted to note that Brad Feld is a graduate of MIT. Christopher Schroeder is a graduate of Harvard. We will forgive him for that one. And of course we have
Don't like you, Chris.
It's okay.
Couldn't get in.
Fiona and I are actually also graduates of Harvard, but we can fix that by getting into the MIT, as faculty and heads of centers. So Fiona is the faculty director of the Legatum Center. She's also the associate dean for innovation and inclusion at MIT Sloan. I consider Fiona to be one of the top thinkers at MIT around entrepreneurship ecosystem. She's also become a very dear, dear friend. And my family is also a huge fan, specifically my mother. So welcome all three of you. I'm just gonna jump in and get the conversation started. I wanted to start, Brad, with you and then follow up with Fiona. Both of you have really embrace this discourse around startup communities and building ecosystems to support entrepreneurship and innovation. But Brad, you've really used the term community Whereas at MIT and Fiona, we tend to use the word ecosystem. And I found it really interesting reading your book and reading some of your blogs, how you constantly bring us back to this word community, although you do also use ecosystem. I'd love for you to share with the audience your thoughts on, is there a distinction between building a community to support entrepreneurship and innovation versus building an ecosystem?
So in the Startup Community Way, in the book that just came out, I finally do what I hope is a good job of distinguishing between the two, not just in what they are, but also in why. So the history is useful. When I started writing the book Startup Communities, which came out in 2012, the phrase startup communities didn't exist. And I started writing that book in 2010, sort of right at the tail end of the global financial crisis. And I was trying to put together a very simple way to describe how you could build this thing, which I ended up calling a startup community, in any city with at least 100,000 people. And it was a function of a lot of discussion that innovation and entrepreneurship would be the way out of the global financial crisis. So that was a decade ago. Startup communities as a phrase then became, I think, very significant. Like it became a phrase that people started to use. It's very clear, and I just came out with a second edition of that original book. I didn't distinguish clearly between startup community and entrepreneurial ecosystem. In fact, in that book, the subtitle has the phrase entrepreneurial ecosystem in it. So when I started working on the Startup Community Way with Ian Hathaway in 2017, it was one of the things that we knew we wanted to try to address. And what we got to was the idea that a startup community has one goal, and that's to help entrepreneurs succeed. That's it. That's the one goal of a startup community. And that's really the nucleus. That's at the core of what a superset of that is, the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Now, the entrepreneurial ecosystem has as a goal to help entrepreneurs succeed, to support the startup community. But the actors in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, which include, university, government, large businesses, nonprofits, have other goals in the context of the entrepreneurial ecosystem that go beyond just helping entrepreneurs succeed. And these are very additive to the dynamic, but it allows, in that context of behavior, where the behavior really is the essential element of what happens in these dynamics between people. If you sort of dig into startup communities, if you've read the Startup Community Way, if you think about how complex systems work, which is the framing we use for startup communities and entrepreneurial ecosystems and how they evolve, it's the interaction between the parts, not the parts themselves, that are so essential. And we really wanted to create a focus on supporting entrepreneurs at the core of this activity, but recognize at the same time that in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, there are many, many more things that are going on that are additive and important that don't necessarily have a singular goal.
Fiona.
Dina, well, first, thank you. And I just want to share my thanks to you for organizing this, and also my appreciation to both Brad and Christopher, who I enjoy reading the things that you have written, and it's really very nice to be in conversation again. This is not the first time we've had a chance to be in conversation, although I think it's the first time the three of us have got together. I think when we talk about this, I actually, there's a picture on, I think it's, I'm going to tell you, yep, page 83 of Brad's book. So I hope everyone has the book, and if you don't, you should. And if you do have it, open it up to page 83, because I think that basically probably describes it as best we can, which is the startup community is kind of nested and embedded in the best world in what I would focus on the innovation ecosystem. I think what's interesting is that when we talk about communities, we talk about shared intent, we talk about trust, we talk about social fabric. And what I like about the emphasis that Brad has put on that is this idea of trust and shared purpose. And it really does speak to a social fabric among people who have very common goals. That idea of community, I think, is not unique to startup communities, although I think talking about it for startups, communities and entrepreneurs is something that Brad started. I spent quite a lot of time, especially when I first got to MIT, thinking a lot about the scientific community. And that's a very old idea, right? And the scientific community, who were really present from the beginning of the scientific revolution, had shared intent. They mostly had shared trust, although they also were competing against each other, right? I mean, we can think about the mathematicians kind of arguing about who got first certain ideas. They had a social fabric. And so I think the idea of community is really important. When we take a step up in sort of level of analysis and we start to talk about ecosystems and we start to talk about innovation ecosystems, I think what we're really asking is how we actually connect a series of communities that might not necessarily always talk to each other, who sometimes have very distinct boundaries between them, who have really different cultural norms and social norms. They have really different ideas of purpose, of trust, and what have you. And sometimes those sort of boundaries end up really in tension. But the ecosystem is, I think, about, when we get it right, is when we try to align around some common purpose. We recognize that our communities are distinctive, but we actually try to build these connected communities. I think when we're thinking about these innovation ecosystems, we are often we need to put the entrepreneurial community, the startup community at the core and think about connecting to them. But it's very much this set of communities that we need to bring together. And because they are quite, they do have that social fabric. I mean, sometimes when they rub up against each other, it's not easy. And a lot of the programmatic work that we do with regions is to actually bring these different individuals together, but they really represent those different perspectives. And so for me, these are definitely nested ideas.
So I just wanted to follow up with both of you, and then I really want to bring Chris into the conversation. You know, I come from an emerging market, which is Egypt, and I think now more than ever, and Brad, you and I discussed this the other day, I'm seeing entrepreneurs really take a leadership role in building out these communities. And you know, I say this, a perfect example of this is one of the co-founders of Faudi, which is the recent fintech unicorn coming out of Egypt. Was the CEO stepped down and decided to start his own venture capital fund and to really support other entrepreneurs, which is, I think, kind of core to what you've been saying, Brad. But having said that, my experience is we really do need other stakeholders to be actively engaged. And what I've seen in a lot of emerging markets is a deep disconnect between entrepreneurs and all the other players in the broader ecosystem. And I'm wondering if you could both shed a little bit of light on how do we get more cohesion, number one, and number two, Brad, I'm going to quote Brad on page 17 of your book. You said one of the things is you don't have to wait. You don't need everyone to be on board. Who do we absolutely need to be on board to start seeing these ecosystems thrive? And who is perhaps maybe not essential? I leave it to either of you to go first.
Happy to start, because I think it hits on a couple of things. And it also touches on a mistake I made in Startup Communities in the 2012 book, which I've fixed in a second edition, and we address very differently. We address differently in the Startup Community way. In the first book, I said, I separated the world into two categories, leaders and feeders. And I said that entrepreneurs are the leaders and have to be the leaders, and you need a critical mass of them. You don't need all the entrepreneurs in a startup community to be leaders, but you need a critical mass, which might be half a dozen or so. And everybody else is a feeder. There were two mistakes that I made in that language, and I just didn't work hard enough on the language. One was I created a one-up, one-down relationship between leaders and feeders inadvertently. I didn't mean to. I meant them as the same. They both have very significant importance, but they're different. And as a result, I should have called them apples and papayas. I should have used neutral language there. That was problem number one. Problem number two was I didn't give voice to the people who work for the organizations that I classify as feeders, who play a leadership role. And the real distinction, so fast forward to what the correct distinction, at least in my framing is there are three different categories. There are leaders, instigators, leaders. Leaders and instigators are people. Feeders are organizations. And the point that I was trying to make with that, the instigators, by the way, are people who work for feeders, for organizations who play a leadership role. And then leaders are entrepreneurs. In the context of that, what you have is you have this linkage between the organizations who have a top-down hierarchical approach to the world and try to organize things. And organizations try to organize, that's what they do, which is antithetical to the growth, development, and evolution of a startup community or a complex system, which is one that's a network-driven model. It's one that cuts across boundaries. It's one, there is no president of the startup community or vice president of membership. You're operating in this network model. But it gives voice to those leaders who work for those organizations, whether it's university or government or large companies or venture capital firms. So that sort of construct is critically important. You do need a critical mass of people playing leadership roles. And in the critical mass of people playing leadership roles, you do have to have a critical mass of entrepreneurs. The trick, though, is to not have the organizations themselves try to control and lead the activity in the startup community. That will stifle it. The example, last comment I'll make, the example you gave, but by the way, when the organizations try to drive, good stuff can happen. But if they're the only ones driving and they're trying to drive it from their perspective, it doesn't sustain over a long period of time. And we see that in lots and lots and lots of different examples where there was something that happened, but then it sort of stalled. The other comment I want to make, which is really important, is you described a concept with that entrepreneur called entrepreneurial recycling. That's essential to the growth and development of startup communities. These take a long time. It doesn't happen in a year. And anybody out there who's been involved in creating startups and building startups knows every now and then there's an overnight success, but most of the time it's 10, 15, 20 years. The startup community has that same kind of trajectory. It takes a very, very long time. And the important part of it taking a very long time is that you have to have enough time for entrepreneurs to have success and then recycle not just their money, but also their talent back into the startup community. And that builds a very strong positive feedback loop as you start to see that happening. And of course, the best example for that is Silicon Valley, where you have 100 years of entrepreneurial recycling that has gone on. And it's not generation to generation, it's a continual phenomenon. So those would be the two different constructs that I would give you. And I see that I'm having some audio problems. Sorry if I am.
It's okay, Brad. You do go a little bit in and out, but Fiona, very, very quickly, and because I know that you have worked with so many different stakeholders over the years, is there anything that you wanted to add? And also, I'm very curious for you to share your thoughts on, and I say this because oftentimes, and actually even when I taught your class, a session in your class last semester, some of the questions that came from people from emerging markets was, what do you do when you have policymakers who aren't at the same level as the entrepreneurs who are moving really fast? What do we do when we have some stakeholders that are weighing us down as opposed to helping us?
Look, I think, and there are many examples on anywhere we think about in countries and regions, particularly when the government is either slow, where the government has a series of barriers because of the various policies in place around things like ease of doing business, or things that are really a drag on the system, corruption and so on. The real challenge is to actually have a startup community that is going to step up and do their work in spite of all that. And then I think the question becomes is how do we, find those individuals, those instigators, Brad, to use your language, those champions, as we would call it, in those governments who are willing to step forward and both recognize some of the barriers that they're putting into place, listen to what the startup community really needs, what barriers they experience, because what we imagine they're experiencing and their lived experience is often really different. And often being willing to listen to much younger people, because given that governments, big corporates are often more hierarchical, there's also big age differences, and really be willing to then go back and take some political risk around sort of driving change. So I think it's not that you can't actually make progress when some of these other key actors are lagging behind, but clearly you can really accelerate progress when you bring them on the journey. But you sort of need to bring those individuals along and then have them bring some of their organizations. I'd say the same is true with universities. So I think universities can play a very amplifying effect by driving the right kinds of talent into the system, being part of what it means to have a really vibrant set of places, and an open set of places and lots of ideas coming into the system. But you really need them to come along. And in some, I think, especially in some emerging markets and in some of the parts of the world, Dina, that you and I both work in, universities are not fit for purpose. And so you have to basically do the job in spite of them. But imagine when you can take even a small number of people and activities and really shift it, I think it has this powerful amplifying effect. So I've seen, you know, in Singapore, people like Steve Leonard, an entrepreneur who's actually then joined the government and created SG Innovate. We've seen it in our work in Halifax in Nova Scotia, where Richard Florizone, who was the Vice Chancellor of the university, really stepping up and just sort of driving some of the change as an individual, but really doing a good job of listening to the startup community. Yeah. And so I think the government and the university has to come on the journey if possible, but I don't think we can wait.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. And Chris, I really want to bring you into the conversation. So, you know, Chris has been a dear friend, and he and I met in Dubai over 10 years ago. I would say when we were starting to really embrace the importance of entrepreneurship to our own prosperity in the Middle East. And one of the things that I've learned from Chris over the years is to always focus on opportunity and not problems, but to really think about what are some of the more hopeful and optimistic things that we should think about as we look at our own markets. So, Chris, I think you and I talk all the time about how innovation and entrepreneurship is critical to our prosperity, but you also always talk about how more than ever there are all these opportunities happening in emerging markets that oftentimes are neglected in the West. What are some of the opportunities that you're seeing coming out of emerging markets, and what are your thoughts, having spent so much time in the Middle East, but also now recently in Asia? What are some of your thoughts about how our entrepreneurship communities and ecosystems are developing?
Well, Dina, first of all, thank you for having me be a part of this and with this amazing, august group that you've pulled together. I'm honored. I want to underscore that in a way to go after opportunity. It's actually something that Brad touched on before about this dynamic of the top down and the bottom up. And one of my favorite quotes that I use all the time, and was in my book, came from you almost 10 years ago. With all your experience, how you made very clear that top-down thinking, top-down institutions tend to think of people as problems to be solved. You poor people, or you people with challenges, we will solve you. But the phenomenon that Brad, I think, describes so well, and he does so well in his amazing book, is very much a bottom-up phenomenon. And as you defined it, bottom-up, look at people as assets to be unleashed, not problems to be solved, but assets to be unleashed. And I think in that lies a fair amount of the answer to your question, because I'm seeing opportunity everywhere, because there is so much opportunity to be fulfilled, with the difference that, one, there are more tools in people's hands around the world to actually go and solve these problems. But secondly, at the same time, there are more people who have actually done it, stepped into it, have learned how to do it, have the empowerment and encouragement that they themselves can do it because they've seen other women and men do it in other places, which I think is unleashing something very powerful. I think Fiona was very clear and correct overall about government, but I actually believe there's some opportunity that is being developed there. You know, we can talk about Singapore as a no-brainer kind of idea of this. I was on the call just before this with the UAE government. Both those countries are embracing innovation and helping entrepreneurship, frankly, way ahead in my view of what the United States is doing. But the fact of the matter is, it surprises us to know that in places like Brazil and Indonesia, the governments are proactively meeting with entrepreneurs, getting involved in the entrepreneurial communities to not just rejigger previous laws and regulations, but to think about fintech, for example, regulations on their own terms. And so to me, the idea that we often think the best thing government can do is step out of the way is still sometimes true, but sometimes there's actually opportunity in what I've just described. The second thing is that I think there's unbelievable opportunity in the acceleration that has happened because of COVID. And it's become a bit of a cliche to say that we've had now 10 years of human adoption of behavior rolled into 2 months, but we've effectively had 10 years of behavior rolled into 2 months. People around the world are buying things and comfortable having them delivered in ways that they were only beginning to touch on before. They're using mobile money when previously they weren't even willing to have a credit card. People who did not have access to banking or financial transactions are beginning to find access to them. Shipping companies are finding innovative ways to move goods and services. EdTech and telehealth, which has been discussed for a very long time, actually is taking root in an empowerment and an idea, because so many people around the world have been forced to deal with it. And that's only one of the accelerations. I mean, technology is an acceleration. We don't even know what 5G is about to leash on us and overall. And I think what ends up happening from all of this is that around the world, in emerging markets and beyond, entrepreneurs are creating solutions and opportunities on their terms. No longer are we in the era where America shows up to a tech-enabled country and wins, like Facebook or Twitter or whoever might have done this 10 years ago. Now people are building things, not one-stop shop, but on their own terms for their own markets. One, those markets are very large. And secondly, rising markets around the world share as much together, if not more, than they share with Silicon Valley. So the pattern recognition and learning from an entrepreneur in Jakarta or Cairo or Sao Paulo is much more shared in combination among themselves than the conversations they've had with Silicon Valley and New York. Final point is China is exhibit A to all of this. Because obviously, I mean, look, I was pitched yesterday an ed tech company that comes out of Silicon Valley. And when I got the woman talking a little bit about this idea, it was very, very interesting and everything else. She effectively came up with the idea because she had seen a version of it in China. So all of a sudden, we're copycatting China? Is that the world that we're in? I've been all around the world where entrepreneurs say to me, China understands the dynamic of emerging market entrepreneurship because they were an emerging market 10 years ago. They understand what it means to navigate last mile logistics. They understand what it means to educate a consumer population who never had this education before. They know about navigating the regulatory kind of circumstances. They know about leapfrog. And so all of this is an environment, I think, of opportunity that, frankly, for me, the biggest question is, are American entrepreneurs and is the American ecosystem understanding this new globalism so they can engage in new and more effective ways than the old ways, which were fundamentally will show up and teach you what you need to know. Like, those days are now over. And in some respects, to me, that's one of the most exciting opportunities of all.
I 100% agree. So I would just add a follow-up, and then I'd love for Brad and Fiona to jump in as well. You know, I think a lot of people in the audience are also curious to know, and to your point, Chris, that there is a lot of emerging market to emerging market conversations and collaborations happening, but how do we start seeing a lot more connections between communities at the local level to the national level, to the regional level, to the global level? What do we need to start seeing a lot more of that collaboration happen, but a lot more of a deeper understanding? Because the reality is the bulk of venture capital is still very much in the United States, even though 60% of the world's economic growth is happening outside of it, specifically within emerging markets. So how do we start seeing stronger country-to-country networks evolve, but also more globally, how do we start seeing that evolve?
I think Brad and Fiona will have some good and better insight on this, but there are two reflections that I would share. One is it's almost a psychological thing, which is you have to believe that we're in an era of a new globalism. You have to say that Jakarta isn't a cute kind of thing as a sideshow that maybe I got burned in 10 or 15 years ago, but it's a country almost as large as the United States of America, with 80% mobile penetration and smartphone penetration, with people doing interesting things, and that solutions that are happening there might be in fact helpful elsewhere. So there's almost you almost have to shift your mental outlook that this isn't just a Western only, or maybe we'll give a little room to China only thing, but this is in fact a phenomenon of size and scale where innovators are not only succeeding on their own terms, I mean, bluntly, they're pushing back Western companies. I mean, there are reasons why for their own interests, but also for competitive interests, that Uber had to leave Southeast Asia. I mean, Grab effectively won. I would tell you Careem won in the Middle East. I mean, at the end of the day, Uber had to buy Careem because the team was great, the market was great, they understood their market. And by the way, if they didn't buy it, at the end of the day, a Chinese company might have. And these are entirely new kind of psychological dynamics. So I think that's a big part of it. But the second thing that I'd say is it's actually happening anyway, quietly. So I can't tell you the number of entrepreneurs. I just had a conversation 2 days ago with a B2B marketplace in the Philippines, and I was starting to talk about other companies in that space I've seen about, and he's already on a WhatsApp group with every one of the CEOs of every company that I met, because they're all sharing best practices with each other, because they all know that there's incredible learning to be shared in markets which are much more coherent to them than what's happening in America. And so some of this is just happening endemically, and I think what we can do is throw gasoline on that fire.
Dina, if I could just jump in, I mean, I think, one mental model one could have is a sort of hub and spoke model where kind of the US sits in the middle and everybody else kind of, you know, comes and pays homage. And I think with Silicon Valley that happened for a while, and sometimes it happens in Boston. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think everything that Christopher described and Brad describes is in fact about different places evolving with some similar patterns and with this sort of level of complexity and some of the uniqueness, and then learning from each other and finding the right lessons to take away. I think trying to get the homegrown dynamics work. So the recycling that Brad has talked about, and in fact Christopher has kind of implicitly suggested, right, with entrepreneurs kind of learning, doing well in their own markets, and then moving to adjacent markets within some of these emerging locations, I think is really what we need to be aiming for. The other thing I'd say though is I think embodied actually, Dina, in people like you and some of your network is a willingness of members of the entrepreneurial community and the startup community, not just to recycle their capital and their experience into the startup community, but to actually go into the academic world, to the universities, into the government, because sometimes talk about becoming effective instigators. And again, I'm going to use Brad's words because I think it helps us just level set. I've seen some, you know, it's always the case, I think, when you have people who bring that entrepreneurial experience to bear, but you put them in these other systems, they can be really frustrating, right? How frustrating is it to work in a government organization? It's very bureaucratic, but you can bring a different mindset. And I think having the wisdom and the bravery to do that, and having those organizations be open to those people, and then those individuals networking. I think about the network that you brought to our work at the Legatum Center, and your you know, willingness and ability to work as an entrepreneur in risk capital, advising the government, and now in academia is a really powerful thing. And I think that that actually helps us move from these separate communities to the kind of ecosystem level of effectiveness. And I see much more of that happening, again, in some of the places Christopher's mentioned. You know, I see that, we see that happening, I think, in Ghana and Nigeria. We see that happening in other parts of Southeast Asia. And that really enables our entrepreneurs to then look to the government and say, actually, we can be part of your solution as system change agents, both with the startups that we create and then later taking responsibility for changing the system that we're working. And I think that's an interesting idea that is very different than how we might normally think of these very separate communities.
I want to give an example of what Fiona just said, because I think it's extremely important. If you look at Colorado as an example, our current governor in Colorado is Jared Polis, who is a very successful multi-time entrepreneur. And the prior governor to Jared is John Hickenlooper, who was also a very successful entrepreneur. And so if you look at Colorado going back to 2011, we've had entrepreneurs as our governor. And if you look at the dynamics of Colorado as a state, and much of the engagement in the state in terms of its own growth and health, there's an enormous amount of linkage between the public and the private sector in terms of public sector, private sector collaboration. Pre-COVID, in terms of just the growth and health across the state, and Colorado is a complicated state because 80% of our population lives in 20% of the land mass. And yet there's a huge amount of people and movement in and out of Colorado because of the ski resorts throughout all of Western Colorado. Overall, it's a very healthy state in terms of growth and entrepreneurship. And then if you look at the COVID crisis and the moment where entrepreneurial thinking is so critical in the midst of an extremely fast-moving crisis, the private sector showed up in a way that I think was very unique in the United States in terms of engaging with and supporting the public sector in that moment of crisis in a way that was very additive from an entrepreneurial perspective. So there's a lot of lessons. You know, we'll need another year or two to then look back on this moment and sort of talk about it in a you know, time arc sort of way. But it's a great example of what Fiona just said, because those leaders understood how to bring entrepreneurial thinking to the mix versus it being foreign to them. The other comment that I'd make, which just, you know, you said we're still, you know, the preponderance of capital in the U.S. That's not true anymore. There's over the last decade, there's been I think if you go back 10 years, you could say 80% of venture capital was US based or some number like that. And I think it's now less than 50% of the global venture capital.
It's true.
China is an enormous other percentage of that mix. So US and China might add up to 70%, or I don't know what the number is, but something like that. But even with that, you're starting to see much more distribution of capital around the world. And also even within the US, in the last 5 years, there's been a lot of movement of capital outside. The three cities that get talked about over and over again are Silicon Valley, which is of course not a city, but a bunch of cities, Boston and New York, and that being the majority of venture capital. There's been a lot of focus and effort on more democratization of capital flows in the US. In my own experience as an investor over 25 years, living in Boston until 95, but then living here in Boulder since 1995, is that money follows entrepreneurship, not the other way around. And I think that government and traditional sort of institutional thinking often is, we need more venture capital here to generate more entrepreneurship. And I have never really seen that work. There are elements of it that sometimes work, but generally speaking, what happens is, if you take a long-term view and you focus bottom up on the company creation phenomena, money is very mobile. By the way, it's even more mobile, to use Chris's example of the current world that we're living in, where we're all, working remotely. Like, geography is mattering less and less in some ways. It's not that suddenly because of COVID that happened. It's that behavioral shift where people are understanding that movement changes. And so in emerging markets, for example, the challenge I think that happens over and over again is, we need to get more entrepreneurship here. We must have more capital here. Therefore, we'll generate more entrepreneurship. And the cause and effect are backwards. And what you need to focus on, or what I encourage people to focus on, is you don't need anything to start the entrepreneurial cycle. And then people can contribute to the entrepreneurial cycle. And over a period of time, that will attract more capital. And when somebody says, well, we don't have any money, we don't have any capital here, in the book, we actually changed the framing. And we have a section we call the 7 capitals, where financial capital is one of those 7. And so what I was realizing was, when people would say we don't have any capital here, they were meaning that we don't have any money here. And I can argue with that in lots of places. I hear that all over the place, including, for example, in Omaha, Nebraska. I would talk and somebody would say, there's no money here. And I'd say, last time I checked, like, Omaha, Nebraska was the highest per capita billionaires in the country because of Berkshire Hathaway and Kiewit. There's money, but it's not necessarily being allocated to entrepreneurship. That's a different problem than there's no money here. And that's a different problem than there's no capital here. All of these things are hard problems, but they're different. And so the cause and effect and the dynamic and the time period around entrepreneurship are different as a result.
So, and I have 2 remaining questions, and then I want to start grabbing some of the really good questions that are coming from the audience. And I think many people in the audience really want to know your thoughts on, considering the extent to which the pandemic has really highlighted how fragile many of our systems are, that has also revealed the incredible need for entrepreneurship and innovation to solve some of the problems that we've seen as a result of the pandemic. To the 3 of you, what kind of partnerships do you think need to really be leveraged right now to help entrepreneurship and innovation continue to thrive? And I'm not talking about capital per se, but I'm talking more in terms of what we had a conversation at the Legatum Center recently, one with philanthropists, one with venture capitalists, and we're always talking to policymakers. What kind of new partnerships do we need to see emerge? And Chris, I see you nodding your head, so I'd love for you to give a few brief thoughts on that.
Look, I think that we get all very excited about, 70, 80% of humanity having access to smart devices, and that there's been this acceleration that I described because of COVID. But I think what is said, the other half of what I just said, is that means 2 billion people don't have any access at all. And that to me is one of the great crimes. I mean, we've been talking for probably 2 decades about digital divide, and there've been some, really powerful kind of small examples of going at it. But we're effectively turning now to 2 billion people and saying, yeah, you can participate in the economy, but by the way, you're never allowed to go on a road. Like, that's effectively what we're saying. If the trajectory is correct of what Fiona and Brad and what I have been arguing here is correct, this problem will not only compound, but it is actually going to leave more and more people behind in a way that they may not be able to catch up. So if you ask me to pick one place to really aim at, to your question, this is no longer kind of a cute thing that we salute. This is actually something which I think has become foundational. And I think COVID has helped at least make that particularly clear to me.
Agreed.
Can I pick up on that? I mean, so one of the things I was really struck by when COVID began, I sat, I think, with you and some of the other people in leadership roles and entrepreneurship and innovation at MIT and said, all right, we need to organize some way of both keeping our students engaged and our alumni and really sort of focusing everybody's brains on these really important problems that we're suddenly facing. And by the time we'd even had the conversation, the students had self-organized, which I think is the important thing that I think we knew, but it was an incredible experience to really watch. And our COVID innovation dashboard just really was all about documenting so that we could build the connections and make sure that people were connected in. And what for me was so powerful about that was that people focus on these challenges. So you suddenly had a common purpose that then brought some of these other actors along. So the philanthropists came along, some of the risk capital, governments, and you could really start to coalesce around some critical challenges. And I think that is the question I have, is when I see, as Chris says, the digital divide, is how do we make sure that we don't take our eye off the ball on some of these really big problems? Whether it's last mile infrastructure, whether it's some of the medical piece, how do we both learn from some of the things that we've seen? I think about all the work in Rwanda around medical and IT and what have you, but how can we keep the communities focus on some of these areas where we really do have a common purpose?
Yeah.
And I think that is what the new partnerships need to look at, and whether or not we're building on some of the advanced market commitments that Michael Kramer and others thought about for vaccine development, whatever it is, I think we need to shift the incentives just a little bit to make sure that we focus on big problems and we focus some of that startup community energy as organically as possible on the big problems, while also recognizing that apps and other such things can be very valuable. I really want to think about how we focus this unleashing of talent on some of these massively important problems, because clearly governments are not going to do it on their own. Foreign aid is not going to do it. There's no demonstrated history of that. We have to do it differently. And so that really does mean, I think, these new partnerships focused on these big challenges where we have common purpose.
Absolutely. And final question to the three of you. I think this transition to a post-COVID world, if we want to call it that, is also an amazing opportunity for us to rebuild systems that are both more inclusive and more equitable. And Fiona, you recently became the Associate Dean for Innovation and Inclusion, and I know that you've been thinking a lot about how inclusion needs to also be at the core of innovation, along with how do we create more equitable systems. So I'd love to hear all of your thoughts before we bring in other questions from the audience of how do we, in focusing on entrepreneurship and innovation, how do we create more resilient economies that are both inclusive and equitable?
Dina, can I frame that really as a question? I'd love to know what the others think. So here's my challenge with a lot of this is, I think, Brad, you used the expression topophilia, right? Love of place.
Yeah, topophilia.
Topophilia, thank you. That sounds like a terrible disease. I also, when we talk about communities, we talk about homophily, right? Which is that birds of a feather flock together. People like to spend time with people who are like them. And so I think that communities are not naturally inclusive. And while we might want our startup communities to be kind of naturally inclusive, I don't think they are, because they're made up of human beings who are homophilous by kind of practice and behavior. And so the question I have is, how do we then somehow weave in inclusion into the core of our culture and our norms? And I've certainly seen that there are some incredibly inspiring examples, actually, Dina, from your part, or from the Middle East and beyond. I think about our friend Hala in Lebanon and Amal in Saudi, and Najla and Sharjah and others, when successful female entrepreneurs and leaders step forward into these roles, they sort of unleash something that has to do, I think, with role models and mentoring that sort of enables some of these inclusive dynamics. And I think we have an opportunity to sort of leapfrog some of the US dynamics and try and do things differently. But I'm not completely sure that I know how exactly to rewire to overcome this very natural tendency of both love of place, but also, frankly, love of people who are more like us. And so that's the tension that I just think is really important to both sort of put on the table and try and solve.
Chris, Brad, do you have any comments on that real quick before I open up from the audience?
Brad?
Yeah, I have an organizational approach that I've used for a long time in companies that I think is applicable to startup communities. And in that 2012 book, and again, if you time travel back to 2012, the phrase, inclusion, diversity inclusion was not a front of mind phrase, especially in tech and entrepreneurship. The third principle of what I called the Boulder thesis is you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage in the startup community. So as a value, it's critical. I think Fiona's comment about the challenge of human beings being inclusive is absolutely an essential comment. It's not the natural behavior. It's also historically in tech companies not been the natural behavior. If you think about the way tech companies talk about things, they talk about culture fit. And I think culture fit is a disgusting phrase. I think it's an unbelievably limiting phrase. And I actually think the word culture in the context of companies is a terrible phrase. I try to substitute the phrase cultural norms. And Fiona, I saw Fiona use the phrase norms. Mm-hmm. And that's important because you shift away from the absolute definition of what culture is, and you get to define your norms, where your norms can include things like inclusiveness, diversity, etc. Then you try to subscribe to the norms, and instead of culture fit, I use the phrase culture add. So every time you engage someone in your company, you're trying to add to your culture in the context of your norms. Somebody used the phrase culture enhancement yesterday. I heard it for the first time. I haven't decided whether I like that better than culture add. They're the same, right? You're trying to extend the dynamics of what are going on versus create a monoculture or create a sort of folding in of itself. I think this is true in companies. I think this is true in communities of all sorts. I think this is true in society in general, depending on how you want to choose it. And interestingly, the idea of culture is a very historical and backward-looking construct. There's nothing wrong with it. But I think in the context of saying we have a culture in our company, we have a culture in our startup community, it's very limiting. And so shifting to say we have norms and defining those norms so that everybody can then agree or disagree with the norms gets you away from this clamping down or lack of diversity or lack of inclusion that happens in so many companies and so many geographies and so many communities.
Love that. Love that. Thank you, Brad. I'm going to transition. We have so many questions and we are running out of time. We do have a question from Afosa Ojomo, who is the co-author with Clay Christensen of the book Prosperity Paradox. He says, per Brad, your comment, time is necessary variable to build an anti-fragile startup community. In many emerging markets where the government is the biggest player in town and often very short-term thinkers, how can we incentivize governments to invest for the long, long, long ride?
It's super hard. And it's part of why in that first book in 2012, I said entrepreneurs are leaders and everybody else is a feeder. It's not just government, it's kind of any organization, right? Large companies run on quarterly or annual rhythms. University, I like to say, runs on an annual rhythm with a 3-month summer vacation, which is just my snarky way of poking at university. Government runs on 2-4-year cycles, and they lose 6 to 12 months in every cycle because of an election, and then what happens after the election. And startup communities run on, you have to have a 20-year view. And now my statement is not a 20-year view that's absolute. I've lived in Boulder 25 years. I'm not on -5 of my 20-year journey. I'm on year 25 of my 45-year journey. So it's this long view going forward. The only real effective thing that I have been able to experience, I've observed lots, but experience with the intersection with government specifically, is that the startup community and entrepreneurs, if they acknowledge and accept that government is working on a different time cycle that they run on their time cycle rather than running on government's time cycle. You're not going to be able to change government's time cycle. All you can do is use yours. And so what then happens, especially if government is the largest player in the startup community, entrepreneurial ecosystem that you're in, as entrepreneurs in the startup community, you continue to focus government on doing things in their time frame that helps entrepreneurs succeed, rather than trying to get them to behave on a different time frame. Interestingly, and just as sort of the final comment, every now and then you're going to run into leaders in government who understand that difference. And that's powerful, because when that time frame disconnect happens, you'll get some longer term thinking, and you'll get some structural things that have a longer term arc. The last is just linked to that. There's lots of things that can help in the very short term. So it's not that you have to say, well, just because you're doing something in the short term, it doesn't help us. But you can't create a dependency that exists, because you run the risk that suddenly that phenomena that you're focused on is going to disappear because of some other priority. The government has allocated something to you over multiple years, and then the government changes, and then that allocation disappears. And that happens over and over again, and you see it. And if you're a victim of that as entrepreneurs, then that's your fault, not the government's fault, because you could have known that that's the behavior and the behavioral norms that you're playing into.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Brad, I love the way you put the entrepreneur at the center of everything, and everything else flows from that. And I think for me, it's one of the things I learned the most from your book is this idea that we as entrepreneurs, we're the ones who need to be in it for the long-term play, right? So being committed in the long term and staying continuously engaged is absolutely critical. Chris, a question for you. You made a very interesting point that the days of Americans going to developing countries and saying, we will teach you how it's done, are over. Can you elaborate on this more? What are your recommendations for what the new model should look like for America's role?
The new model is co-authorship. In some respects, it's the best model of what has been done in entrepreneurship within the borders of America, but now it's something there, which is a presumption that there's a lot that we can bring to the table, and a lot of experiences that is valuable, that we're always meeting with people who have their own expertise and an own understanding of what's happening, not only in their backyards, but even technologically, or how product needs to be developed for those areas. And it is a co-authorship. That's for me, the watchword for 21st century co-engagement. The idea that anybody is sort of simply saying, you do it my way. If you want to be a tech company, you got a headquarter in Silicon Valley, or you got a headquarter in Beijing. Like that's no longer, I think, part of the playbook at all. We have to have a presumption that there are billions of people who know what they're talking about, know what they want better than we do. Then we can share insight, and we can accept insight and do something very exciting together.
Love it. Co-authorship. Love it. Another question. Startup Community Way talks about the need for catalytic and continuous events like hackathons, meetups, mentor-driven accelerators, and Fiona as well has written quite a bit about this topic in particular. What examples of those have you seen in emerging markets? What has been helpful in instigating those kinds of events? I leave this to Brad, Fiona, whoever wants to answer.
I've had the opportunity and the honor of working with teams in our REAP program from Lebanon, from Saudi, from Lima, and I think they're using many of the similar sorts of approaches. So whether it be hackathons and accelerators, I was really struck when we worked with our very first team from Saudi, from Al Madina. their work on hacking the Hajj, thinking about that as a huge sort of market opportunity, a huge challenge in the sense that you have many, many people coming together who all really need support around whether it be food and health and location, and just engagement, and thinking about the opportunity that that presents, and bringing together a community of entrepreneurs, doing that in collaboration with different government departments and agencies, but really, again, letting the entrepreneurs take the lead. I actually have seen some interesting models that our friends in Ghana have put together. Thinking hard about with accelerators, right? You have so many different variables you can pull in terms of length of time and how you structure mentoring and so on, trying to do it in a way that, again, doesn't take the specific playbook, whether it be from Techstars or Mass Challenge, but to actually adapt it to the community you're trying to build, the problems you're trying to solve. Do we need more on the education side? Do we need to think about the capital? How do we do that in a way that is actually meets people where they are with what they actually need? And so again, to pick up Chris's language, I would say, co-authorship, co-creation. This is not people sort of parachuting in. I think there's a sort of humility about this. And increasingly, I will say that as an academic institution, MIT has done some amazing things around entrepreneurship education, but I'd say increasingly we learn much more from others than I suspect we can teach them, because there are so many interesting experiments going on in some of the universities around the world that we would be foolish not to go out and to learn and be humble about it and then co-create. And I think that's what we try to do at the center.
Yeah.
I want to underscore what Fiona said. When you look at experiences that I've had through, I would say primarily Techstars in emerging markets, of which there's now, numerous accelerators. In Abu Dhabi, we had an accelerator in Dubai. We also have startup weekends that have happened all over the world. And in fact, at the beginning of Startup Community Way, I talk about an example of that in a moment where there was a startup weekend in a country in the Middle East, and sort of my experience interacting in Las Vegas with that entrepreneur. The key is, again, it being a local bottom-up phenomena. When Techstars shows up in a country or in a city, it's not Techstars saying, here's how you do it. It's Techstars having a framework, recruiting a local managing director who's part of the startup community to run it, recruiting mentors who are mentors in the region and successful entrepreneurs in the region, and then connecting that accelerator or that program into the global Techstars network. And so it's showing up, and we'll use Chris's word, co-creation. It's showing up, creating something in the region, but with the leadership of the people in the region driving it. So it's not showing up and saying, hi, we're here to help, or hi, we're here to show you how to do it. It's, hi, we're bringing some resources here. We want to be part of this with you. We want to learn from you, and then we want to have it reflect back on everything else that's going on. And that mindset, I think, is so essential. At the same time, it's completely entrepreneur driven in many cases. So my partner Seth Levine and I are supporters of a program called Gaza Strip Geeks. And it's amazing, right? It's just amazing. Gaza Sky Geeks, sorry. It's just amazing to see not just the short-term impact. We wrote, both of us wrote a check at in the very beginning when they were doing a crowdsourcing thing. Seth's actually quite engaged in a number of things in that region, and we personally invested in a handful of funds in Palestine and in Israel, and sort of the dynamics of that overlap and the linkage between the two in a hopefully constructive way. Not where we're trying to do anything but support. The interesting phenomena is to watch over a 5-year period of time all of the things that emerge from that, from the bottom up, from the entrepreneurs, and to start to see the change really dramatically start to happen as a result of the entrepreneurial leaders. So I would just come back to all of these events, all of these activities that are so essential, not just cocktail parties and networking events and Entrepreneur of the Year events and convening events, but actually practicing entrepreneurship together, or using entrepreneurship to make functional change in the dynamic of what's going on. when the entrepreneurs are driving it, magic happens.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to ask all of you, there's so many questions and we're out of time, unfortunately, but one question that was raised that I think is very interesting. There are many of us, many entrepreneurs who are taking on that leadership role and who are playing pivotal roles within their entrepreneurship communities and their markets. And one of the concerns is how do you, and I think all three of you have said we really need to be in this for the long term. How do you prevent burnout? How do you stay committed in the long term, knowing that, you know, entrepreneurship is a very demanding space from whatever angle, graduating from entrepreneur to investor to being an academic promoting the space, all of this requires a lot of effort and time. So how do we prevent burnout, and how do we all stay committed in the long term while we're still energetic and able to give back?
I'm going to start because I don't want to have the last word on this one. I'm about to turn 55, and I have struggled with this for my entire adult life. And I write and talk openly about it with my own struggles with my mental health, but you can put whatever label you want on it. And for me, part of it definitely is continual burnout and exhaustion from the dynamics of what's going on. So I don't know that there is I don't believe that there is a universal answer. Like, I don't believe you can say, here's the way you prevent burnout. As I wander up on 55, one of the things that has become very clear to me as a human is that it's really, really important to continually explore and learn about yourself and understand yourself in the context of all of the different pressures that we have as humans, independent of where on the privilege spectrum we are, independent on where on the success spectrum, wealth spectrum, you know, gender, ethnicity, quality of life, place we live. Like, there are so many different challenges that we each individually face that in my own experience, the leaders and the entrepreneurs, and I'll just say leaders, the leaders willing to be introspective, that are willing to go deep and view themselves as something that is also evolving and changing, recognizing, for example, that at 55, I don't have the energy that I had when I was 25. At 55, I care about different things than I cared about when I was 25. And I have the capacity for a different kind of engagement because of my lived experiences at 55. But I also have the capacity to learn from other people's lived experiences that are very, very different than mine, that when I was younger, I might not have been able to be tuned into. So I answer that from a very personal frame of reference, which is, it is a mystery. And I think it is part of the challenge of life's mystery, how to maintain a high level of energy and engagement over a long period of time. And for me, I don't know how to do it. But I do know that it's so many different things that I am learning myself by continuing to, when I struggle, go deeper on it, try to understand why I'm struggling. When I get tired, learn different ways to take care of myself. And in the context of the intensity, especially, for example, around a crisis like COVID, you know, which is multiple crises, or a business failure, of which I've had multiple in my life, learning how to develop more empathy and resilience in those moments, not just for others, but also for myself, so that I can kind of pick myself up and keep going.
Absolutely. I completely connect. People ask me all the time how I continue to do a million things at once. And I always say, you know, I don't know. You do the best you can and you hope that it works out. And, you know, I've never asked Christopher Schroeder to do something and I've never received a no from him. And I often wonder how he does it. But I do, and, you know, honestly, and I know that Fiona stretches herself thin all the time, being an advisor to the Prime Minister of the UK, having such an important role at MIT and so forth and so on. But everyone in this audience, so many people I see in the participants are all leaders and who do their best to stay engaged and never say no because they believe in what they're doing. And so I'd love to end this conversation by a follow-up question to Chris, one last question to you, and then I will end with Fiona. Chris, you know, during the Egyptian revolution, I would always reach out to you and I would, you know, say, what is there to be optimistic about? And you would always say to me, it's not about optimism, it's about hope. And as long as we have hope, we can continue to move forward. So to the audience, what are you most hopeful about today? Coming out of this global pandemic, or we don't know if we're coming out, but where we are today, moving from this space that we are in, what do you have to share with the audience about what you're most hopeful about?
You know, we've just spent an hour of hope, in my view, and you as an individual, and Fiona, the work that you've done, and Brad has been decades of helping people find the deepest hope that they have in themselves, and that to me is where a lot of it begins overall. But every day, I mean, we can get caught into the CNN, you know, view of how everything is terrible, or we can just celebrate the fact that there are unbelievable healthcare workers doing amazing things right now, and there are amazing entrepreneurs doing things right now, and there are families who are coping with impossible circumstances of educating their kids and somehow keeping it all together. And I could go on. Literally, I could spend 20 minutes with a whole list of what we see. And it is from that from the ashes of what we've come through, I think that there's going to be amazing opportunities if we are willing to step up. And so that for me is deeply hopeful.
Yeah. Fiona, there were a couple questions from the audience about why the Legatum Center, and why is the Legatum Center so critical at this particular moment in time, and why should more people get involved and engaged with us?
Well, I think everything that we've talked about reminds us that, you know, we are at a moment, and I think we have been for some time, where there are such tremendous opportunities. And if we think about entrepreneurship and innovation and these communities and these innovation ecosystems as something that's well beyond an American phenomena or even a European one. But in fact, this is something that I think if we can, as we get these communities going, these extraordinary market opportunities that can solve huge and important problems, and we unleash this extraordinary amount of global talent. And what I love about the center is the fact that we have students who are so deeply committed to what they're doing, to their entrepreneurial journeys. We try to support them in the way that works for them. And they go either home or they go to countries that they care deeply about. They pick those places where they want to be, and they make such a difference. And they don't just sort of pass through our corridors and then leave. They become part of this extended community, frankly, to use that word. And we keep in touch with them, and it's learning from their successes and helping them through the difficult patches that I think is so energizing. And it's such a privilege to get to do that. So for me, that's why.
Thank you. Brad, one last question. There have been many questions from the audience about advice you would have from entrepreneurs considering everything that's happened with COVID and the many struggles that entrepreneurs continue to face. What is one piece of advice that you have to give to these entrepreneurial leaders across the world who are in the audience and who will listen to this at a later time?
I have two. I can't give one. One is take the long view. Just recognize that entrepreneurship is a long arc phenomena, and you're in a moment in time where your business might be benefiting from COVID, or your business might be really suffering from COVID. But it is a long arc. And so pay attention to the long arc. And it's linked to the second thing, which is the next decade is going to be an incredible time for entrepreneurs, because COVID has stressed and broken an extraordinary number of incumbent behaviors, not just companies, but behaviors. And as a result, that dynamic will have a profound impact on how things in our world work. It's not going to happen immediately, although some are, right? For example, the fact that we've all now learned how to work with video conferencing globally all the time. Chris started with a couple of examples of things that are happening in many places around the world that don't have the same incumbent structures as deeply rooted, for example, as in the US. This will happen much faster. And so it's a huge opportunity for entrepreneurs. If your business is under a lot of stress because of what you're doing in the context of COVID, take a step back and try to look for the opportunity in the shift of what you're doing rather than hope for us to go back to where we were in January 2020, because that's not going to happen. And instead, your opportunity in front of you could be a transformation of what you're doing based on all of the stresses that in a very short period of time, all of the incumbent systems have had.
Thank you, Brad. That's a wonderful way to end this amazing discussion. And I just wanted to say to the three of you, I'm deeply grateful. This has been an amazing discussion, and I know how busy the three of you are. So I'm truly, truly grateful that you joined us today and supported the Legatum Center in this discussion. I hope that you'll continue to have conversations with us. I think entrepreneurship in emerging markets is critical. We're at a very critical time in our own journeys, and I hope that you'll continue to take part in those journeys. And to the audience, thank you for joining us. And to my team, who I could not do any of this without. I wanted to thank specifically Kevin and Julia and Courtney from my team for all the effort they put into making conversations like this possible. I know there are so many questions that we did not get to, but I know many of them were answered throughout the discussion, but please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. And I hope that we'll be able to, in a few months, do a follow-up conversation, just because there are about 40 some questions that remain unanswered. So thank you all again, and thank you to everyone who attended.